Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome. It's great to see this audience of well-dressed, attractive, enthusiastic people on a Saturday morning to talk about climate change. Who would have thunk, right? But we're really pleased that you're here. Welcome to the first ever Global MBA Summit on Climate, Capital, and Business. So this is a first of its kind, hopefully not the last. And I hope you all really enjoyed the kickoff yesterday. I think really fascinating discussions. I've heard great feedback from everybody on the discussions with Scott Jacobs and Matt Arnold in really queuing these issues up. My name is Dan Vermeer. I'm the Executive Director for the Center for Energy Development in the Global Environment, what we call EDGE Center here, and I'm a professor at the Business School and also at the Environment School here at Duke. And on behalf of our center and our university, we welcome you. We hope that you enjoyed a little bit of Southern basketball hospitality last night, found a place to watch the game together, and are meeting new people that you can continue a really important conversation with. So great to have you all here. Katie mentioned several of the thank yous, but I'd like to just, first of all, thank all of the students who have come on a Saturday morning, especially those of you who have traveled here, taking a risk to get on a plane or get in a car to come to a weekend conference on climate change. We really appreciate that, that you made the trip and that you're part of hopefully something that changes the conversation. I also like to thank the Duke students that are in the audience, especially those that have been volunteers and fellows in helping to get this all set up. Our sponsors, our knowledge partners, our academic partners. It's been really great to see the level of excitement about the event grow, and we said, well, no, this isn't just a Duke event. This is a national event. We have 15 different universities from around the country and around the world that are participating in this conversation. So I think raising it to that level, realizing the shared stake that we all have in this has really brought people together in a powerful way. And I'd like to thank my colleagues at Fuqua, the film crew, and the organizers, and especially Katie Cross, that's done an amazing job to get us to this point. So first of all, I'd just like to thank Katie. So why ClimateCAP? About a year ago, Katie and I had a conversation, and we both were reflecting on the many events that we go to externally. We've been to many events that are on climate change and business, and said, you know, this conversation is happening in the private sector, but we don't see it happening in the same level and the same intensity and certainly the same level of sophistication among our students in the MBAs. So we decided that really there's a need and an opportunity to invite a deeper conversation about the relevance of climate change to business among MBA students. So we targeted the MBA audience. We wanted this not to be a conference. We called it a summit because we don't want it to be only a series of talking heads, but that we invite you into a conversation. And I'll talk a little bit more about the agenda in a moment, but my view is if you sit passively listening for a day, you might have moments that you're excited, but you'll walk out and it'll be pretty tough to remember what happened here this weekend. So I want to make sure that everybody has a chance to check in this conversation. So make a point of the conversations in the hall and especially in our afternoon sessions, the industry sessions, that you check in and start verbalizing what you see as relevant to your career, to your life, and to the business world about these issues that we're discussing today. So why now? Some people, when we started, said, yeah, maybe you should talk about climate change, but maybe you could call it something different. And we decided we didn't want to do that. We felt it was really important to have a conversation about climate change, to raise the level of visibility and awareness, to have an open discussion about what is it that we know and what are the unknowns, because both of those are relevant if you're in business in trying to make decisions for your organization. We believe that this is a moment where, because there isn't universal government leadership on this issue, anything but, in some ways it raises the ante for business. They are more visible, more vulnerable, more counted on to provide the leadership and the vision and the pathway forward on this issue. So it's not a moment to step back, it's actually a moment to step up, whether you want to or not. in this leadership vacuum. And in the real world, those of you who make everyday decisions about your business are thinking about climate change all the time. And we'll hear from several people today. Diane Holdorf from Kellogg and many of the other speakers will be talking about, decisions that are driven by climate factors, things like operational decisions, things like investment decisions are driven by considerations related to climate. Understanding how your risks are changing and transforming, where you want to invest, and where the policy debates might go. All those are everyday kind of considerations for everyone in business now. So in that sense, climate change is uncontroversial. It's a feature in the landscape and an increasingly important one. We also wanted to target MBAs because we feel like there is a delta we want to address. While many students, especially those that are part of net impact or pursuing energy or sustainability careers, may understand this issue in depth, the mainstream MBA audience doesn't have as much awareness about this issue. And in fact, we have a group of graduate students from Fuqua and Keenan Flagler at UNC that have done research on this issue recently. And I just wanted to share a couple of the highlights of the research that they've done in the last few months. They found that most MBAs don't rate climate risk to be as material as, for example, something like digital security or labor issues, but they are very responsive to new information. When they're given information about the risks that are driven by climate change, they respond and raise the priority of that issue pretty quickly. So we know that there's a kind of delta. The implication is that we need to increase the quantity and quality of the information about climate change and use it to inform our investment decisions. So I think a lot of the discussions that you'll hear about disclosure and about quality information are really critical in closing that gap of awareness. The second thing they found is that most MBAs don't feel prepared to assess climate risks. They may be aware of climate change broadly, but they aren't necessarily able to map that to specific manifestations like food security or involuntary migration. So understanding climate as a systemic force that drives outcomes in a variety of ways that have real business implications, I think doing that mapping is still not on the radar. So the implication here is that we need to learn how to connect the dots. So this research, I think, has been really helpful in framing the issues. I think we are in the midst of kind of a developmental process. The first phase, I think, of this discussion is that climate change is real, but it's outside business. So why is that? It's because climate change is the ultimate wicked problem. It has many stakeholders. It's really hard, really hard to define. It's hard to connect cause and effect. The actions you take now can be displaced decades or even centuries into the future, and that those who are most responsible and empowered to take action also have the biggest stake in the status quo. And those that have the least ability to influence are the ones that are affected the most. So this is a kind of classic wicked problem. And so it's not surprising that this has been a hard issue to get our arms around. I think following that kind of idea that climate change is somehow outside business, I think the idea of risk and that climate is a threat multiplier has now become quite socialized among most business professionals. They're aware that the planet's average temperature has risen almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit since the late 19th century. Most people know that 16 of the 17 hottest years on record have been since 2000, and now there's empirical evidence, not projections of models, that point to acidifying oceans, rising sea levels. You know the story, right? So we now are not looking at what we think the future might be, but we're seeing it happen in front of our very eyes. The World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report has seen this kind of rise of climate-related risks go to the top of the agenda over a lot of the other issues that are on the business agenda. This one is increasingly seen as a kind of interconnected set of priorities that businesses have to wrestle down. And we know that there are real costs associated with climate change. Just in the U.S. government, due to extreme weather and fire, the U.S. government has spent about $350 billion in responding to climate-related issues. And I think a useful framework is the one that the Bank of England came up with in identifying there's actually 3 categories of risk. There's physical risks, the things like the storms and floods, and of course, all of that is, as we project into the future, not fully known. So it's based on models, so trying to understand those physical risks. But there's 2 other kind of risks that are not directly related to those physical risks. One is liability risks. How many of you know about the children's lawsuit against the U.S. government for not taking action on climate change, or Schwarzenegger's recent statement that he wants to sue the oil companies for first-degree murder? Now, I'm not saying that these are legally viable, but I am saying that there is a category of liability risk that has to be on the radar for companies. The third is the most interesting to me, which is a transition risk. The idea here is that as the issues of climate change unfold, it'll drive investments in new technology, it'll drive policies, and companies and economies that don't continue to tack to the kind of awareness of the world that we're heading into are placed at an increasingly risky position. So a sense to get out of sync with what we know about where the world is going sets us up for a disruptive, disorderly transition sometime in the future. I don't think that's in our economic interest, and it's not in our societal interest to let ourselves just sit back and wait and build the pressure in that rubber band. So I think a lot of interesting issues that we'll get to unpack here. I think the third phase is seeing the opportunity of climate change investment and growth and transition in our economy. So all of these, I think, are really important frames for thinking about climate change, both through the lens of risk as well as opportunity. And so let me just highlight a few points before we get on with the program. What should you look for? I'm going to give you a few questions to look for today. The first is, what are the hidden risks and the hidden opportunities? So we all have kind of a short list of what we know is coming, what we are familiar with in terms of the risks and opportunities. The business advantage will be built around the hidden risks and opportunities that aren't well known, aren't well understood, and there's real competitive advantage in seeing those things before others. Number 2, how will climate change play out by location, by industry, and which countries will really take the lead on these issues? So I think the localization of climate change is really critical. 3, timing. What are the consequences of a delayed start? And I think we can say we are in a position of a very delayed start on climate change, things that we may have addressed 2 decades ago that we're still waiting for the right moment. So what's the consequence of that delayed start? 4th, what's the future of climate information? I think some of the disclosure efforts around climate are really critical for businesses as they begin to see and expose the kind of vulnerabilities that they have around these issues, as well as where those opportunities are, and those increasingly being taken into consideration by investors. And finally, what new industries will emerge and evolve as a result of this? And I'm really excited that I think there are whole classes of industries that haven't even been created yet that will be imperative not only for the future growth of our economy, but for the well-being of society long term. So a call to action. You know, former President Obama said we're the first generation to feel the effects of climate change and the last generation who can do something about it. That's you and me. That's us in this room and everybody that we can touch. This is the moment that we can step up in. And so I encourage all of you to recognize that's an opportunity that is sort of unprecedented. It can be scary, it can be confusing, but it is certainly the most exciting of times. Let me give you a sense of where we're going to go today. The logic of the summit, we started last evening by creating a framework of risk and opportunity. Today we're going to address what do we know and who has a stake in action on climate change. So this will include a briefing on climate science and policy, a panel discussion on pricing climate risk and investment. We're going to explore the future of energy, We're going to evaluate how companies might pursue strategies and assess the value of climate action. And we're going to understand how business schools might revise their curriculum to prepare future leaders for this challenge. After lunch, you're all going to go into industry breaks. That does not mean it's a good time for you to do some other work. Please attend. It's very tempting after lunch. Emails. Let the emails rest. It's Saturday. Nobody wants you to respond on a Saturday, so please attend. So you'll have a chance to engage with others. We'll come back to discuss what's the innovation portfolio that is emerging. And finally, we'll bring in some people who've been working on these issues a long time to understand the essence of the leadership opportunity around climate change. So with that, I would like to introduce our first couple of sessions. I'm pleased to invite Catherine Mock from Stanford University to do our first presentation. Catherine leads the Stanford Environment Assessment Facility, where her research is focused on integrative assessment of climate risks and response options. Before going to Stanford, Catherine co-directed the working group for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the gold standard on knowledge on climate change, which culminated in the fifth assessment report of IPCC. And Catherine received her PhD from Stanford and her bachelor's from Harvard. That'll be followed by a panel discussion on investors' perspectives on pricing climate risk with Kate Gordon from the Paulson Institute, Elizabeth Lewis from Terra Alpha Investments, Mark McDivitt from State Street Corporation, Ron Temple, who's from Lazard Asset Management, and that panel will be moderated by Dan Siccardi from Ceres. With that, I'd like to invite Catherine to the stage, and we can begin.